Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with host Peter DeWitt. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure every student is learning, not by chance, but by design.
Happy Monday, Ariel. How are you?
Thanks, Peter. I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's always a good Monday when Tom Guskey is somebody I get to talk to. So
that's right. That's right.
Such a great conversation about grading and assessment, something that is just, I feel like it's a hot topic. It's always been a hot topic. I've been in education almost 30 years, and it's been a hot topic for that amount of time. And he has such a great way to break it down as he does in this podcast that people are about to listen to.
That's right. Yeah. I love that he talks about how, even though we know so much now, there's so much research out there around grading, we still see so many practices that aren't working. He talks about how we often use grading it becomes a game where we see the grade as the end result. And I love that in this episode, you say at one point, grading is not the end. It's just a snapshot in time. And we often forget that.
And the hard part is and it's definitely what people are going to hear in this podcast, is that it's something that we don't talk about enough, because we do look at grading as an ending. And Tom mentions, people hear this, Tom mentions the fact that there are multiple reasons for grading, because I'm glad he thought it was a good question, but I just wanted to know, what is the purpose of grading? And when he went in and said one of the 6 purposes was that of an incentive, that's not often what people think of when they think of grading. They almost think of it as a punishment, which is something we talk about. And as he tells some really great stories, one about his own son, but one about a student who actually taught him a lot when Tom was a 7th and 8th grade teacher back in the beginning. So I'm really looking forward to people hearing this conversation. I have talked to Tom numerous times. He has been somebody he's been a mentor from a presenting standpoint, from a writing standpoint. He's written numerous guest blogs for me for Finding Common Ground, and has become a good friend over the years. And it just doesn't matter how many times I talk to him. I always find this to be life-giving conversations.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I completely agree. And Peter, I know Tom has a new article out. Can you tell us the title of that article? Because I didn't catch that.
It's in School Administrator, and it's for May 2021, so it's on now, but it's Undoing the Traditions of Grading and Reporting. And he talks about one silver lining from the ongoing public health crisis. Awesome. And it's in School Administrator, so people can find it there.
Great. We'll definitely link to that in the show notes too. Good. But for now, let's get to the conversation.
Tom Guskey, welcome to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Well, thanks, Peter. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today.
Tom, I have to admit, our paths cross a lot, and I always appreciate. You may not remember this, but years ago when I was starting to see that I was speaking a lot, I actually reached out to you and asked, and you were such an excellent speaker. I remember seeing you speak, and you were excellent, just in every sense of the word. That I reached out to you and said, I see that I'm going to be speaking a lot, and I really enjoy watching you and listening to you, the command you have over the content, how you stand, everything. And you were so gracious. You actually sent me a very long email with several resources about what I could look at. And that was very, very helpful. It was just about 6 months later, I found myself giving a keynote and you were in the audience. And I was thinking, oh no, what if he thinks I never listened to a word he said? What if I did? But I appreciate all the guidance you've given me. And you've written some of the most impactful guest blogs that I've ever had on my Finding Common Ground blog for Education Week. You have a way of taking the research, but also making it so practical and understandable, which is not easily done at all. And to be able to do that in 1,200 words or less is quite the gift too. But the topic that we often talk about is grading and assessment where you're concerned, but I've always looked at your research around self-efficacy and everything else too. But why is grading such a hot topic, even you would think over decades, like it just, we would have it figured out. And I feel like we don't have it figured out. Why is grading such a hot topic still?
I think there are a couple of reasons that it remains on the forefront of everybody's mind. And one is that we basically persist in traditions with grading. When we first began investigating, look at the research base, what surprised us was to discover not only how much we know, but how long we've known it. And then third, how little of what we know has found its way into practice. And along with others they're looking at this history of research in this area, we're always surprised and sort of shocked to find out this terrible gap between the knowledge base we have and what finds its way into practice. And also that we in the United States are even more behind than other countries around the world. I mean, we seem very reluctant to take on the challenges of reform in grading. A couple of years ago, we were wanting to do a series of videos on grading practices. And we looked for school districts that, according to what we were discovering from the research, were doing things pretty well. We're pretty progressive in their approaches, and we're having some great success in it. We ended up shooting everything in Canada because the Canadian schools were so much more progressive and so much more sort of involved in making it better, where we here in the States, we're still bound by tradition, and we hold on to those traditions in such a passionate way that it really sometimes deters us from doing things that are actually better for students.
So where does that gap exist? You say this gap between the research and the practices that are happening in schools. Like, what are some things that Canadian schools are doing that make them progressive as opposed to, what's happening in the US in classrooms?
Well, one of the things in particular, and you and I have talked about this before, is the notion that here in the United States, we combine all these diverse pieces of information into a single grade or a single symbol. And so every grading period, teachers take evidence on student achievement, homework, formative assessments, their participation in class, punctuality and turning in assignments, and they put that all together into a single grade. Researchers refer to this as a hodgepodge grade because it includes so many diverse elements. We have aspects of achievement along with behavior and effort and responsibility all combined into one indicator that really miscommunicates. It doesn't give us an accurate portrayal of what the student knows and is able to do. In Canada, for decades, they have been giving multiple grades. They, instead of a single grade on the report card, have an achievement grade. But along with that, they also include perhaps a separate grade for homework, a separate grade for class participation, a separate grade for punctuality and turning assignments. Now, the really odd thing about that is that when I first came upon their system, I asked them specifically, I said, it looks great, but it looks like so much extra work. And they turned back to me and said, it's easier than what you silly people do in the States. I mean, we collect exactly the same information you do. We just don't worry about combining it at the end. And so all those arguments you have about how you weight stuff to determine that single hodgepodge grade, we don't have to deal with it. The teachers there love it because they find that kids take homework more seriously when they get a separate grade for homework. It's not masked in an overall achievement grade. The teachers like it too because if a parent questions them about an achievement grade, the teacher just turns and said, well, look over here. Maybe if your child started doing homework a bit more regularly, or maybe if they started participating in class, the achievement grade would go up. The parents like it because it can profile the performance of their students in school. And the college universities also like it because it gives them a better indication of the total picture of that individual. You don't have this single grade, but instead a profile. In some schools, they call it a dashboard of information that identifies all these different aspects to it. So instead of the irresponsible high achiever getting the same grade as the highly responsible low achiever, in the Canadian schools, those grades are different. And they find that so much better and so better as a communication device, both between schools and families, but between schools and third parties too.
So why are we so resistant to change our ways? Where is it just, is it laziness? Is it we have this philosophy that's ingrained in us that one grade is supposed to be the best? Like why, with all the research that you're looking at, why are people so resistant to changing something that obviously makes a lot of sense?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, there are these long-held traditions. It's the way we've always done it. Parents are accustomed to those sorts of things, and so it sort of eases the communication in that way. But second, grading is one area in education where technology is working against us. All computerized grading programs that are available to educators in the United States are based on these very traditional models of grading, and so they perpetuate that. In order to make change, you have to actually remove many of the default functions that are part of the computerized grading program that your district has purchased. And I can't necessarily fault them for that. I mean, they developed these programs not based upon our knowledge of best practice, but based upon what's going to sell. And what's going to sell is what people have always been doing. And so they developed their grading programs to make the process of grading similar to what's already done, but ease the calculations that might be a part of it. But as a result, it ends up perpetuating these practices that we know don't work, that we know can be detrimental to kids, and hence it's not the thing that an individual teacher can change. In order to change, they have to change this entire system of technology that's been imposed on them, and how they record the evidence and how that evidence is then reported to students and to their families.
I know this is going to sound like a really silly question, but I feel like sometimes just the basic question is the best. What is the purpose of grading?
Well, the fascinating part of that is probably the question that every discussion on grading should begin, but it's also the question where we have the greatest diversity of perspectives. Now, researchers have actually asked that question of educators, and they find that the responses of most educators can generally be classified into about 6 major categories. That one of the reasons we do it is we're trying to communicate information about students' performance in school to parents and the families. A second reason is to provide information for the students themselves, especially for the purposes of self-evaluation. A third purpose is that we use grades to identify, select, or group students into various instructional programs. So you have to have decent grades just to pass from one grade level to the next. You need high grades to get in honors and advanced classes. And low grades are typically the first indication that some additional assessment may be necessary to determine if a student has special needs. 4 is to provide incentives. Now, people argue about that all the time, but the evidence is pretty clear. I mean, the first thing students ask when a teacher announces there's going to be a quiz or an assessment is, does it count? And if the teacher turns to the students and said, no, it doesn't count, well, who studies for a test that doesn't count? 4, we use grades when we evaluate the effectiveness of various educational programs. Hopefully, if the program is working well, we want students' grades to be going up. And then finally, to show evidence of appropriate effort or responsibility on the part of students. Now, any of those we could argue are legitimate as purposes. The problem is that you can't do them all. And in some cases, the purposes are counter to each other. And so if you choose as your purpose to communicate to families and communicate to students, what you would hope is that all the students would do well. But if all the students do well, then they all get the same high grades. There's no variation in the grades. If there's no variation, now you can't use it for evaluation. You can't use it for selection because those two things demand variation. And so here's where most schools really struggle. They charge ahead changing their grading methods without dealing with the core issues of purpose first. And that really has to come first. So actually, we advocate this as the first step in getting into that reform of grading policies and practices. Decide your purpose, reach some consensus, And what school leaders find is when you first sit down with your faculty, you'll find they're all over the place. And that requires, as you and I have discussed before, this process of we disagree, but commit. That you come together, you bring people together that have these very different perspectives, but then realize that we're working with the same organization and we're working with the same sort of group of professionals trying to provide a wonderful educational program for these kids. We have to reach some consensus. And so we disagree, but then we commit to this particular purpose. And you can serve multiple purposes, but you can't put the single device. So even with the report card, what you want to do is print the purpose on the report card itself in bold letters right at the top. Say, this is the purpose. Once you decide the purpose, then questions about method become a lot easier to address.
I feel like, and I really appreciate the fact that you said one of the pieces that's important about grading is the whole idea of incentive, because I feel that's clearly understandable, right? You get a good grade and you've got the incentive to keep progressing, keep maybe going deeper or whatever. But I sometimes feel like teachers give grades as a punishment. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like it's a punishment. For example, in the past year, one of the conversations that I find myself having a lot with leaders that I coach is that of ghosting. Students are not showing up, just, or they're showing up, they're turning their camera off and they're muting themselves. And I find it to be a very frustrating conversation sometimes, because there are schools that their teachers are given a high number of Fs. Mm-hmm. And I feel like grading is being used as a punishment. And what happens to the kid is that they have to go to after school, or they have to go to Saturday school or something like that. And I feel like what happens is that we're punishing the kid for ghosting instead of really looking at why they might be ghosting in the first place. We're not looking at the fact that, maybe at the beginning when pandemic teaching and learning happened, which it happened. We didn't know we were going through a pandemic. We had never seen that before. Yeah. Students weren't allowed, they had to mute themselves. They weren't allowed to turn their cameras on. They couldn't be in breakout rooms. And then over time, okay, you can unmute yourself. You can put in the chat. So I feel like we're somewhat responsible for why kids were ghosting in the first place, because we built that dynamic. And then we're giving out these grades where they're failing. And when I'm doing these remote learning walks and going in, I see that the teachers who are giving the high number of Fs are not necessarily the most engaging. And I feel like part of the purpose of grades has to be not just the grade we're giving because it seems like a punishment, but also maybe to reflect on our own actions as teachers to understand how we're engaging kids in the first place. Is that like a piece of it too, or?
It's absolutely. And you made so many good points in what you said. I mean, one of the first is it's true. So many times teachers see grades as their control. You can, as a student, you can screw up and mess around and not do what I tell you how to do. But the bottom line is this: I have the grade, and I can fail you if you don't adhere and be compliant with what I have to say. So when you take that away, you're taking away a major aspect of what teachers see as their primary mechanism for control. And that means that we have to find other ways where teachers can have influence other than having to be sort of punitive in that threat of the failing grade overall. But I think your other point about communication is so vital as well. You are absolutely right. School districts across the nation, even after we got through the pandemic last year and began this year anew, the failure rate of students has gone up just astronomically. I mean, we're finding the number of failing students in school districts across the nation is increasing 3 and 4 to 5 times greater than it ever was before. And we see evidence of this in like Minneapolis, Salt Lake City, many of the school districts in California, especially outside of San Francisco, surrounding San Diego. But one of the sort of interesting aspects of that too is that it's compelled district leaders to look more carefully at these grades and how they are determined. And what they've discovered is that in many cases, the students are receiving failing grades not because they're not learning, but because they haven't been compliant. Mm-hmm. They haven't turned in things on time. They haven't turned on their computers when they're supposed to. They haven't engaged as they were. When when you pull those sort of behavioral aspects out of it and just look at what they've learned, we cut the failure rate in half. And that's astronomically. Now, what that says is, number one, if they can pass without engaging, how important is the engagement in the first place? But second is, what are we doing to kids? I mean, we're failing them because, not that they're not learning, but because they haven't been compliant. That's one of the great advantages of this notion of giving multiple grades. And I guess I've told this story before of the experience I had with my own son in the school, where he was, he's very bright, but he's also very obstinate and gets set in his ways. And so he's a math kid who just gets math quite naturally. It just comes to him. I think I'm okay in math. He's amazing at math. And so in high school, he was taking advanced placement calculus, but he just got it. It came to him very quickly. And so he would question, why does he have to do the homework? If he can show the teacher he's got it, why should he have to do the homework for it? Or if all the teacher's going to do is goes over the same strategies that are outlined in the book and he can read the book and get it, why does he even have to go to class? So he wouldn't do the homework. He'd skip class. He wouldn't leave school. He'd just finding in the tech lab doing something he thought was more important. He takes advanced placement calculus. The first year he takes the AB version, which is a pretty difficult version of it. He gets a 5 on the AP exam, which is the highest you can get. The second year, he takes the BC version, which is the much more sophisticated. Not only did he get a 5 on the AP exam, he was one of 38 kids in the country who got a perfect score, but he got C's in calculus because his teacher zinged him because he wouldn't do the homework. And he and I fought this battle constantly. He would say to me, you're an educator, right? I said, Michael, but you have to understand it's a game. He said, Dad, that's my point. It's their game, not mine, and I don't want to play. Yeah. So he graduates from high school as a National Merit Scholar, not in the top 25% of his graduating class, because he refused to play the game. And see, every teacher has kids that are like Michael. Yeah. But every teacher has kids at the other end of the spectrum that are compliant, who do everything they ask, who turn in everything on time, who are always there in front of their computer, who take advantage of any extra credit the teacher offers. Might not perform so well on those tests. Both could get C's, but they communicate something very different about those two students. And so that's why just separating those aspects can be so powerful and so much more meaningful and really communicate more accurately what the kid's really being able to do and how well they're performing in school.
See, and wow, it's a very powerful story. And I think that speaks to, for me, it speaks to the power of grades, because I worry that sometimes that grades can be an ending, not a beginning for kids. It can really shut them down. You and I have talked about the fact that I was a struggling learner and barely graduated from high school. And if I wasn't somewhat stubborn and maybe didn't have the family support that I had, I may have just dropped out of college altogether and, started working in the paper mill in my local town. But I feel like there were certain classes where I saw myself as a failure because the grades, my grades were not good. And I looked at it as an ending, not as a moment in time. And it took me years later to understand that it was a moment in time. It doesn't mean that I wasn't going to get it. It's just at that point I didn't. And that's why I think that the conversation around grades is so vitally important too, because I understand the accountability aspect of we have to give grades that are going to be fair and an accurate measure of the students at that moment of time, but also there needs to be some sort of communication about the growth that can happen out of it too, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's so important. In fact, probably one of the lines that is most quoted from a book that I wrote on grading was that a grade doesn't describe who you are as a learner, but where you are in your learning journey. Mm-hmm. And where is always temporary. Yeah. And so to get away from that, of a grade labeling a kid and to move away from this. And I guess I want us all to be helping students understand that the purpose of school is to learn, not necessarily to earn the grade. mean, one of my other stories that came from my very first year of teaching. I began in education as a middle school teacher, and I taught grade 7 and 8. It was our practice as 8th grade teachers that we were expected to give final examinations to our 8th graders. We thought this was a good thing. We thought it would prepare them well for high school. And I remember the very first year doing this because I'd prepared the exam and I was standing outside my classes as one of my 8th grade classes were coming in, grading, talking to my kids. And down the hall comes my superstar. I mean, Jessica had done so well in the entire year. And I was so pleased with what she'd accomplished. And she came in, I said, "Hi, Jess, how are you today?" She said, "Fine, Mr. Guskey, how are you?" I said, "I'm great." I said, "Jess, did you study for your exam?" She said, "No, not really." I was shocked. And I said, "Jess, this is a really important part of your grade. How can you not study for your exam?" And she looked at me really quizzically and said, "Well, Mr. Guskey, I worked it out. I only need a 50.2 for my A. I don't have to study to get a 50.2. Wow. This 8th grader had worked it out to the 10th decimal place, what she needed to do to get the A in my class. And she was surprised that I didn't get it. And I thought, oh my goodness, what have I done to this brilliant young woman that to her, school was not about learning, it was about getting a grade. And she had done her job and was surprised that I didn't understand that was what it was about. And from that time on, I've always been just terribly concerned about what we do with grading with kids. And if this is affecting my top kids, what's it affecting to all those who don't have those same advantages?
It's interesting how, when I think of Tom Guskey and grading and assessment, it's interesting how interactions with students like that can set you on a different direction with what you think about a topic. And one of the other interesting aspects to me for grades is that one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is this whole idea of self-sufficient learning, right? Like it's so dependent. It seems like grades are so dependent on what the teacher is teaching, the standards that the teacher is teaching, the content from the teacher's point of view. And yet one of the things that we know has been an issue over the years is what about how we care about the learning that students do on their own, right? What's the intersection between what they're learning in our class and how that can transfer to the learning that they really want to do on their own? And yet they've got grades on one side, which they knew are very important. And then they've got something else that they're very passionate about that they might not be graded on at all. Right. What then becomes important to them, right? And it's just interesting to think about the intersection between grading and what does that do for those students that want to go on and pursue other interests, but maybe the pursuit of a grade gets in the way of doing that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's such an excellent point. And again, I would say that most of the research in which I've been engaged for the last couple of years has really been looking at the perceptions of grades and grading practices among students and parents.
Yeah.
And we find one of their greatest concerns is the inconsistency in teachers' grading policies and practices in the same school. Mm. And so as kids move from class to class, all the rules change. The purpose of grading changes, what counts part of the grade, all that changes. Now, some students start to see this as a huge game, and they become strategists in game, understand it well and how to play. When my student Jessica, she had it down, right? But for a lot of kids, it's a total mystery. Yeah. And so if we talk about grading being a communication device, then a grade should not surprise a kid. But yet, so many parents tell me that they'll be sitting at the dinner table before the report card comes out, and they'll turn to their child and say, "What grade are you going to get in this class?" In all honesty, the child responds, "I don't know," right? It's up in the air. And so the idea of bringing clarity and meaningfulness and accuracy and honesty to it is just such an important issue. But it does, as you reminded us, it starts with this notion of purpose.
Yeah. It's just, it's so, to me, it's, I really like the fact that you were talking about being an incentive and what are we doing there when we're thinking about grading. And I think that sometimes, and I feel badly for teachers because they might have high caseloads of students, right? And giving a grade is something that you go through and do quickly. because you have to get your grades in. They've got to be in by Thursday. And it takes it away from, there's so many things I think in school that are powerful places to engage in dialogue. Faculty meetings could be a powerful place. Learning walks could be a powerful place from a leadership aspect. Grading could be a powerful dynamic to talk about, right? And yet we don't always have time, and it's more of a reactive standpoint. If I'm mad, I'm going to go and talk to the teacher because I didn't get the grade I thought. Right. Or, as opposed to if there's a reaction that I'm going to have because I'm surprised by the grade, then I'm going to be more likely to talk about it. But if I'm getting a really high grade and I'm surprised but happy, then I'm probably not going to pursue the conversation with the teacher. And I feel like it's hard because there's a lost opportunity, and it also has everything to do with time. Not everybody has the time to be able to do that. Yes. You recently, you have many articles and books. I know you've written some, like I said at the beginning, you've written very powerful guest blogs for me, which I'm always thankful for. But you wrote an article that's coming out with School Administrator called "Undoing the Traditions of Grading and Reporting." And what I really like about the subtitle here is the whole idea that says one silver lining. So you're talking about the silver lining that has taken place. What are these? You mentioned 2 improvements that have happened during a time of COVID. What are the 2 improvements?
Well, what we've tried to understand as we return from the pandemic and try to come back to in class instruction is what did we do within the sort of remote learning things that worked and what didn't work. And one of the very first things we did with grading was to reduce the number of grade categories that the teachers had to consider. The college and universities were the first to take this on. So when we went to remote learning, places like University of Chicago and Stanford University and Harvard University went very quickly to just a 2 grade category, success or unsuccess. Pass, most didn't call it fail, but it was like pass or incomplete, like that. And with that, any faculty member only had to establish 1 cutoff for the grades, and students had to only consider 1 level criteria versus 5 letter grades, A, B, C, D, and F, with 4 distinct cutoffs. And they felt it was necessary to do that just to be fair to faculty members and to students. And schools followed suit. Many schools went to, success or unsuccess or success incomplete type of grading strategy of just the 2 categories. Now, when we returned, and a lot of schools, having gone through that process of establishing that 1 cutoff and seeing how difficult it can sometimes be, turned to what they were doing before, and in many cases, they had percentage grades. Well, with percentage grades, you have a grading system where you have 101 categories of student performance with 100 cutoffs, 2/3 of them denote levels of failure, right? And then teachers looked at it and say, wow, we struggle with 1 cutoff. How can we go back to a system with 100? It just didn't make sense. And so one of the positive aspects you're seeing as schools return to sort of in-class instruction and getting kids back, when they look at grading, is to have fewer grade categories. And we're particularly abandoning the percentage grades. Of all the grading systems they have available to us, the one that is most difficult to defend from a practical, ethical, or educational perspective is percentage grade system. I mean, the reliability of percentage grades is so poor. I mean, equally skilled and competent, experienced teachers looking at the same body of evidence typically disagree somewhere between 10 to 15 percentage points in assigning a grade. That's huge. I mean, that's typically more than a letter grade. And so recognizing those differences, then we've really been able to think more carefully about the meaningfulness of grades, fewer grade categories, and moving to just maybe a letter grade system where we have 5 categories. At my university, we have actually gone from the 5 categories down to 4. I mean, when we returned and people started thinking about the D grade, I mean, why do we have a D grade for university work? I mean, D has always been the gentleman's F anyway, right? I mean, you can't stay in school with Ds. And so we've gone to a system of A, B, C, and F. Ironically, many school districts across the nation, when they were going to the sort of pass incomplete, had a debate about what level should be set for pass. One particular school district that we worked with in Pennsylvania started with a survey where they surveyed the faculty and all the teachers and all the school leaders in the district and asked them, at what level should we set this sort of success criteria? Should it be set at the A level, the B level, the C level, D level, accordingly? And quite to the district leadership surprise, 97% of the faculty, 94% of the parents said the C should be the lowest. And so they had all the evidence then when they came back to say, we don't need the D anymore. We're going to go with just 4 category performance, A, B, C, and incomplete or unsuccessful. So I think that's the first, going to fewer grade categories so we can be much more consistent, much more reliable in the grades we assign. And the second is what we have already talked about. That's the notion of giving multiple grades, of sort of profile of information on student performance, where we have the product grade, which is the academic achievement. Then we have process elements, and process have to do with like learning enablers. Homework, for example, is a learning enabler. Class participation doesn't reflect learning per se, but clearly enables the process. We have a whole area of social emotional learning skills. So here's where responsibility and growth mindset and grit and perseverance sort of fit in. Then there's a third category of process, which is just called compliance. And compliance is, did you do what I told you you had to do? Did you turn it in on time? And we're separating those out. And that gives better, more accurate information. You are able to get a clearer picture of what the students has learned and a clearer picture of the steps you might want to take to bring improvements. So those two things seem to be the major elements, the idea of multiple grades and the idea of fewer grade categories. And teachers, it's not necessarily designed to make the process easier for teachers, but it is designed to make it more meaningful and more honest for teachers, for parents, and for the kids.
Yeah, and one of the things you said with the first one too, when you were talking about how you were looking at universities like Stanford, I know that when people are talking about grades and when they talk about things like feedback, I've read articles where superintendents, school principals, parents have said, when universities change their practices, we'll be able to change our practices. It's kind of like, we're not going to do it before they do it kind of thing. So do you think that's a good precedent to set on the part of those universities? Do you think they're sort of the trendsetters there, and maybe this will help maybe change a little bit of the practices that are happening at the high school level too?
Well, I have two approaches to that question. On my nastier days, my response is, well, let's see. That means if the kids are likely to see poor teaching when they go to college universities, we should teach as poorly today as we know how. How is that preparing your kid? I mean, we don't exemplify bad practice because they know they're going to face it sometime in the future. That doesn't the way we should be going about it. But on my more reasonable days, my other response is, look, we are doing some things at the high school level the college and the universities wouldn't imagine doing. Percentage grades. We can't find colleges and universities anywhere that report percentage grades. I mean, they have letter grade systems with 5 categories. That dominates. In some cases, they'll add plus or minus categories to it, and that takes you up to 12, 13 categories of grades. But 101 categories of grades, it just doesn't seem reasonable. So why would high schools want to have percentage grades if college universities aren't doing it? It just doesn't make sense. And so it's the notion of what we can do to best prepare students for what they're going to face tomorrow is to learn excellently what we have to set out to teach them today. Mm-hmm. I know even when students leave my classes here at the university and they take another class in the same area, a more advanced class, that professor is not going to use the same techniques that I do. Instructionally, they're not going to use formative assessments and they're not going to grade in the same way. But I am convinced that my students do better in that situation, having learned excellently what I set out to teach them than they would under any other conditions. And I think that's the best preparation we can offer. We want to exemplify the very best of practice. And maybe when our students reach that level, they will begin compelling university professors to use those same things. You know, we look at changes in grading reform, and in many places across the United States, it's kind of going from the lowest elementary grades up. And part of that has to do with just the challenge. It's tougher to reform grading at the secondary level, primarily because of curriculum differentiation. I mean, at the elementary level, basically all second graders are studying the same stuff. Mm-hmm. That's not true of all sophomores in high school. Right. So curriculum differentiation makes it tougher at the secondary level, but we're filtering up. So if we're filtering up within our districts from K through 12, why would we not want to also filter up from K-12 up to university level, rather than expecting universities to push back on what we're doing here? In many cases, they are. I mean, we have been looking recently at grading practices at college universities, and they are highly diverse. But we're finding some of the best practices are occurring in some of the most selective institutions. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you are admitted to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in your first year there, you're not going to get any grades at all. They have decided not to give grades in the freshman year. Their whole idea is their admissions department gives the faculty the top 2% of kids in the world. There's no reason for them to have to discriminate among them. I mean, those kids are going to bust themselves to do well. And so they automatically take on that whole pressure of getting grades in the first year. They have very high expectations for their students. And if students aren't meeting those expectations, they counsel them to provide them with the guidance they need to succeed in that environment. But they're not worried about grades during that time. It's a wonderful thing. College universities don't rank their students. You know, they all employ the Latin system of a criterion-based cum laude system when it comes to graduating students. Why do high schools feel they have to do class rank? Mm-hmm. And so there are messages we can take from what the secondary institutions are doing, but recognize they are just as diverse as we find diversity in practices among high schools.
Well, I have to say, Tom, thank you. It's you get my wheels turning whenever you start talking, and it's so interesting to me because of the fact that I think between the common sense part and that's very brilliant. That's exactly what we should be doing. I think one of the things that you mentioned is that whole idea of, are we engaged in these grading practices because we've always been engaged in these grading practices?
Right.
And maybe we need to be able to look at that. And certainly the two places that you just talked about and that you wrote about in Undoing the Traditions of Grading and Reporting are going to be a good place to start. But Tom Guskey, thank you so much for being a guest on Coaching Leaders podcast. I always appreciate your time.
Oh, Peter, it's always wonderful to have conversations with you. You always make me think in new and different ways, and I really appreciate your ideas. Thank you.
So, Ariel, I don't know what to say besides the fact that every time I talk to Tom, I learn something new. He's one of those people that when I have a conversation with him, he makes me want to go deeper in the conversation. Like he inspires me to ask deeper questions. Mm-hmm. I mean, I honestly went into this interview with like 2 questions that I was going to ask. And because I just knew when I talked to him that he was going to inspire so much more dialogue just in the things that he talks about. And what people don't know, and we didn't get into it in this podcast, but what I want people to know is that his doctoral chair was Benjamin Bloom. So we talk about like Bloom's taxonomy and everything else. And he was actually Guskey's doctoral chair. And to me, that's just mind blowing. I couldn't imagine being in a room with Benjamin Bloom and Tom Guskey and, seeing what that was like. But what did you like about the conference?
Oh gosh. I mean, so many things, like you said. Tom has such great stories. But then also just, really understanding the variability in grading. And it really hit me when he said that the percentage grading is just not defensible from an equitable, standpoint or in a lot of ways. But because there is so much variability, even within a school about what grading means, I mean, it's really amazing that anyone can, get consistent grades because they mean such different things. I mean, think if you are a straight A student, that actually means that you've had to jump through all kinds of different hoops to accomplish those A's, and all of those A's mean something different. I mean, it's really, that was just kind of an aha moment for me.
Yeah, I feel like if we could de-implement one thing in schools, would be grading practices, and then re-implement them in a different way.
Yeah.
And Tom's work definitely provides us with the guidance to be able to do that. So I just want to thank everybody for listening to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with Tom Guskey this time around. If you haven't read a lot of Tom's work, or check out his article, Undoing the Traditions of Grading and Reporting. It's in School Administrator magazine, but also that will be a gateway into a lot of other research, because not only has he been doing deep research for decades, he also has a very practical way to be able to talk about things that just become common sense. And I think he did that very well in this podcast.
Yep, definitely. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for listening. Please leave us a review. You can listen on Apple, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, and watch us on YouTube. And we will see you next week, or you'll hear from us next week with our last episode of the season with Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Ariel, good to see you. I'll see you next week.
Bye, Peter.